Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a senior at Harvard, and this is a lecture on public opinion. Today, Professor Peterson is going to break up the lecture in two parts. Part 1, defining and measuring public opinion, and Part 2, nature of public opinion. Let's start off with defining public opinion. What is it?
Well, in the words of V.O. Key, who taught at Harvard some years ago, he said, "To speak with precision about public opinion is a task not unlike coming to grips with the Holy Ghost. There must be something to it, but it's pretty hard to get your arms around it." Well, he had a pretty good view there, exactly what it was. More formally, we define public opinion as aggregation of people's views about issues, situations, and public figures. A very academic kind of phrase. V.O. Key put it better. Those opinions held by private persons which governments find it prudent to heed. That makes more sense. Latent public opinion. How will people respond if you do something? This is the kind of public opinion politicians really care about. That sort of latent public opinion it may not be what they say, but it's what they're going to do in the next election. So the public may not say, we only care about jobs, but maybe that's exactly how they're going to vote. So that would be called latent public opinion.
When do we start getting accurate polls of public opinion?
You know, the concept of public opinion didn't really exist very much, or people didn't have any agreement as to what it meant until we got opinion polls. And the first opinion polls were pretty bad. So in 1936, when a magazine called the Literary Digest, that later becomes Time magazine, it predicted that Alf Landon would beat Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936. Well, that was a disastrous prediction because FDR trampled Landon. Well, why did Literary Digest get it wrong? Well, what they did is they sent out postal cards with their magazine to their readers, and they asked people to send them in with their votes. And it turned out that the kinds of people who read Literary Digest and filled out these postal cards were very educated, upper income kinds of people who vote Republican. And so it was not a representative sample of all Americans, but it was a very selected group. There it is, the Literary Digest. Well, after that experience, polls fell into disrepute. But Gallup began creating his own kind of poll, which was a much more representative poll. We're going to see why it was in a minute or two. And he accurately predicts Harry Truman's victory in 1948, even though the news media got it wrong when the early returns came in, because the early returns made it look like Dewey had won, but they were biased because they were just East Coast returns and didn't pick up the fact that Truman was doing very well in the South and the West. So actually the poll turned out to be better than the early election returns, and now we know that can often be the case. So any early election returns are always interpreted in light of the polls.
Why was the Gallup poll accurate while the Literary Digest one failed?
So the accuracy of the Gallup poll is based on the fact that they had a random selection of respondents. And this idea of choosing respondents at random has been said by some people that to be one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century in terms of our knowledge about people and what they do. We have two kinds of ways we do randomness. We randomly assign people in experiments to pill and placebo in medical research and other kinds of research. And that's a great invention that's enabled us to detect whether or not medication works or not. And then in terms of getting into public opinion, by picking people at random, formally at random, you make sure that everybody who you pick is picked as if it were a lottery. So you're really running a lottery every time you're doing a poll. Now, the theory behind it is that you're generalizing from a sample to a population. And if the sample is randomly selected, it will be the same as the population. In order to know what a population looks like, that green circle there, you don't have to talk to everybody in the population. If you draw a sample that's picked, if you have a lottery and you throw the whole population into that lottery and your computer brings out a sample, that's a truly fair random, there's no cheating, then you're going to be able to predict the way the population thinks based on what the sample says within a margin of error. There's always going to be some error, maybe 1%, 2%, 3%, but within that error term, you're going to be able to tell whether or not the population is leaning in a Republican direction or Democratic direction in a particular election. So random selection eliminates selection bias. So what was wrong with the Literary Digest is that they selected people in a non-random fashion, that there was a selection of a certain kind of people, the kinds of people who fill out postcards and read Literary Digest, and it means some people were excluded. In random selection, nobody gets excluded. The sample becomes representative. Without it, it's not. So, as I said earlier, remember also that this idea of random selection works in clinical trials where you divide the sample into two randomly selected groups, and you can assume that two groups are identical to one another because they have been randomly assigned. There's always going to be some error term associated with it because it's not going to be perfect, but within an error term, it's going to be pretty good.
Do we still have bad polls today?
Well, there's plenty of them. There's probably more bad polls out there today than ever before because there are so many people who are doing petition drives and call-ins and text votes and mail surveys, and they are always unrepresentative. So anytime you see the results from a petition drive or from a call-in show or some kind of a mail survey where you volunteer to send in your vote, don't believe a single one of them. The only kind of a survey you should believe is one where they've made a special effort to make sure that it's a random selection process. That's the way you get a representative sample. Now, even in the case of random studies, you can have a bias because some people may just refuse, or they may not respond at all, or you can't reach them. This is one of the problems that we're running into with telephone calls now, because you call up people on the telephone and they don't answer the phone anymore. So can telephone polls actually give you a random sample anymore? So that some people are saying, well, let's go to the internet. And you can survey over the internet, but you have to select the respondents randomly. It's a tricky thing to pull off, but some people have found a way to do it.
How good are polls at predicting presidential elections today? Which poll is the best?
That's what everybody wants to know. And actually, there is no such thing as the best poll. You can see some results from the last two presidential elections here. In 2008, Obama won by 7.3 percentage points. And the Real Clear Politics average for that election predicted that he would win by 6.8%. Now that's pretty good. That's within 1/2 of 1% dead accurate. Now what makes the Real Clear Politics average so good is that it averages polls. It doesn't take any one poll as exactly correct. It draws an average from all of them. But even the Real Clear Politics average, which is a website, you just go to Real Clear Politics and Google that and you'll find it. If you go to the Real Clear Politics average in the last election, 2012, it didn't do nearly as well. It said that Obama was going to win, but it said that Obama would win only by less than 1 percentage points, when in fact Obama won by 3.9 percentage points. And if you look at the average is made up of a lot of polls: Politico, Rasmussen, IBD, CNN, Gallup, ABC, Monmouth, NBC, Pew Research. So all these polls were out there and it took the average. Well, they all were about the same. As you can see there, some said 3%, so ABC gets credit for that, Pew Research gets credit for that. But it's not like they're always better. There's always going to be a lot of variation in which survey is going to be accurate. So if you assume that most surveys are going to be pretty accurate, there's always going to be some error, and you take the average of a whole bunch of them, that average is usually, but not always, going to be better. It was fantastic in 2008, not so well in 2012. Why? Well, I think the main reason is that people who were Democrats turned out to vote and people who were Republicans weren't. It was surprise. It was the minority population that turned out to vote and the white male population that turned out not to vote. That's probably what happened.
Does wording on survey questions affect people's responses? If so, to what extent? And how does this present a challenge for measuring public opinion?
So the really big issue in polling is the way you ask the question. And if you just ask a simple question like, who are you going to vote for, Republican or Democrat, Obama or Romney, then it's not so difficult to ask the question. But when you get into specific questions or you're asking about public opinion on an issue, then it gets to be much more complicated. So the sampling technique is scientific. Random assignment is, or random selection is a really scientific way to proceed. But asking the question is an art form. There's no clear scientific standards. And the responses will vary depending on the wording. So responsible pollsters try to get fair wording. They try very hard to be fair, but even that can be difficult. And then sometimes you get really ridiculous questions being asked. So there was a big flap in the news media, which Roper one day reported that 22% of the population believed in the Holocaust, did not believe in the Holocaust, that it had ever happened, and 12% weren't even sure. Well, that's a huge fact. A third of the U.S. population is not sure that the Holocaust ever happened. Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? That was the question. And people answered in such a way that it seemed to be a rise of anti-Semitism sweeping the United States, and that's the way it was covered in the news media. Well, the fact of the matter is that's a very, very bad question. If you look at that question carefully, you can see just how impossible it is to figure out what the question is asking. And people were just totally confused by the question. Now, what Gallup did to prove that point was they asked that question to half of the sample, and to the random other half of the sample, they asked a sensible question. Do you doubt that the Holocaust actually happened or not? And no, I don't doubt it, said 88% of the population. Yes, I doubt it, says less than 10% of the population. So this is a much more sensible pattern of responses. I don't think this is a particularly good question. Do you doubt that the Holocaust actually happened or not? Probably it should have said, did the Holocaust happen or did it not happen? That would have been even more straightforward. But still, it shows you how if you ask a bad question, you can get misleading responses.
How about the connotations of the words you use? Will that affect people's responses?
Well, here's a good example. If you ask about welfare, nobody likes it. If you ask about assistance to the poor, it's much more popular. So should you spend more money on, do we spend too much money on welfare? Yes, we do. 53% think that. Too little? 19%. Then the rest think it's about right. But if you ask about assistance to the poor, 47% think it's too little, and only 23% think it's too much. So helping the poor, that's popular. Welfare, not so. So if you ask about the wording in a general way, you will get one answer. If you ask about it in specific ways, you get a different answer. So if you say, would you favor or oppose cutting spending, or would you rather have a tax cut? And if you put it, well, entitlement programs, would you favor or oppose cutting spending on entitlement programs in order to reduce the federal budget? Well, people will say, I want the cuts in entitlement programs. Of course, they don't know what entitlement programs are. So if you put the words in government programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and farm subsidies, which are very popular, then people will oppose the cuts. So that's the debate that's going on right in Washington to this very day. On the one hand, Republicans oppose entitlement programs, and the public supports them. The Democrats support Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and farm subsidies, and the public supports them. That's the debate. It's the way you phrase the question. It's the way you frame it. So would you prefer to see the rest of the budget surplus used to cut taxes or to increase spending? Everybody wants to cut in taxes. But if you say, well, should we use the rest of the budget surplus? This question was asked when there was a budget surplus. There isn't one right now. Then people would say, why? I want to increase spending on education, Medicare, and other government programs. I don't want to cut taxes. So if you start using the words one way or another way, you can get different responses from the public. Well, that creates a question. Do we really have any such thing as public opinion? Is there something to this Holy Ghost of public opinion out there? Well, we'll come back and talk about that in part 2.